On a morning in the summer of 1998, a man walked out of a house in Palo Alto, opened the door of his car, and came back inside holding a check. He had been in that house for maybe 45 minutes. Two graduate students had shown him a search engine demo on a laptop. He had asked a few questions, done some quick arithmetic in his head, and made a decision. He didn't need more time. He didn't need another meeting. He didn't need to call his lawyer or his accountant or convene a committee. The check was for $100,000, made out to a company called Google Inc. The only problem was that Google Inc. didn't exist yet. The company hadn't been incorporated. There was no bank account to deposit the check into. The two graduate students, Larry Page and Sergey Brin, had to scramble for 2 weeks to form a legal entity before they could even cash it. That check became the first outside investment in one of the most valuable companies in human history. The man who wrote it was Andy Bechtolsheim, co-founder of Sun Microsystems, one of the most consequential hardware companies ever built. The man whose architectural decisions in a Stanford laboratory in 1980 had quietly determined how the Internet would be constructed. By 1998, he had already built one company that changed computing forever. He was about to fund another one that would change everything else. And 12 years later, the company he had built, Sun Microsystems, would be sold to Oracle for $7.4 billion, a fraction of its peak value, in one of the most painful corporate collapses in Silicon Valley history. This is the story of one engineer's extraordinary trajectory through the most transformative decades in the history of technology. What he built, what he funded, why the company he started outlasted its own relevance, and what the gap between those two outcomes reveals about the brutal specific economics of the technology industry.
Andreas Maria Maximilian Freiherr von Mauschenheim, genannt Bechtolsheim, was born in 1955 in a farmhouse in Bavaria, with a name so long it filled half a birth certificate, and a childhood so isolated from modern technology that it may, paradoxically, explain everything that followed. The house had no television. The nearest neighbors were not close. For a child with the specific kind of mind that finds electronic systems more interesting than other children, the absence of distractions was not a deprivation, it was permission to build things. By the time he was 16, Bechtolsheim had designed an industrial controller for a nearby company built on the Intel 8008 processor, programmed in binary code because he had no access to software tools that would have made the job easier. He didn't use the tools that didn't exist. He worked with what was available. This response to constraint, not frustration, not complaint, just quiet adaptation, would become the defining characteristic of his engineering practice for the next 40 years. He competed in Jugendforscht, the German science competition for young researchers, 3 times, winning the physics prize in 1974. He studied electrical engineering at the Technical University of Munich, supported by a scholarship from the German Academic Foundation. He was frustrated by the limited access to computers, which in 1975 were not yet available to ordinary students in the way they would become within a decade, so he moved to the United States. A Fulbright scholarship took him to Carnegie Mellon, where he earned a master's degree in computer engineering in 1976. Then an internship offer from Intel brought him to Silicon Valley, and when that arrangement fell through as the Intel contact relocated to Oregon, Bechtolsheim made the decision that shaped everything else. He enrolled at Stanford University as a PhD student in electrical engineering. He would never finish the PhD. He had more important things to build. Stanford, in the late 1970s, was embedded in an ecosystem that no other university in the world quite matched. The computer science department had ARPANET access. Xerox PARC, the legendary research facility where the graphical user interface, the mouse, and the networked workstation had been invented, was a short drive away. Bechtolsheim, who had arranged what he called a no-fee consulting arrangement with Xerox, meaning he received no payment but had free access to observe the research being done there, spent time at PARC watching engineers use the Alto,
a powerful personal workstation that Xerox had built for its own researchers and inexplicably never commercialized. Bechtolsheim was, by his own later account, bewildered by this. Xerox had a machine that was genuinely extraordinary, a 32-bit personal computer at a time when personal computers were 8-bit toys, and they weren't selling it. He went back to Stanford and built his own version. The SUN workstation, Stanford University Network, was a 32-bit computer with built-in networking designed to cost around $10,000 rather than the hundreds of thousands that comparable mini-computers from DEC and others required. It was powerful enough to run serious technical software. It was connected to the network by design, not as an afterthought. And it was affordable enough that research groups, rather than entire departments, could consider buying one. Bechtolsheim tried to license the design to existing computer companies. He got lukewarm responses. So in 1982, he did what engineers frustrated by institutional indifference have done throughout the history of American technology. He started a company. Sun Microsystems was co-founded in 1982 with Vinod Khosla, Scott McNealy, and Bill Joy. 4 people in their 20s, all connected through Stanford, each bringing something the others lacked. Bechtolsheim brought the hardware. Joy brought the software. He had written the BSD version of Unix at Berkeley and was arguably the most talented systems programmer of his generation. McNealy brought the business instincts and the competitive drive. Khosla brought the strategic vision and the initial organizational energy. By 1988, Sun had reached $1 billion in sales. By the early 1990s, it was one of the fastest-growing technology companies in America, selling Unix workstations to engineering firms, universities, financial institutions, and government agencies that needed serious computing power at prices that didn't require executive approval for every purchase.
The significance of what Bechtolsheim had designed into the Sun workstation from the beginning, networking as a native capability, not an option, compounded slowly through the 1980s and then rapidly through the 1990s in ways that transformed from an engineering preference into the structural foundation of the Internet itself. Sun's NFS, Network File System, introduced in 1984 and published as an open standard rather than kept proprietary, established the model by which computers shared files across networks. Sun's workstations, running Unix and connected to ARPANET-descended networks, became the machines on which the researchers building Internet infrastructure did their work. The TCP/IP networking stack that Sun shipped as a standard component became the model that other manufacturers studied and implemented. In August 1998, Sun co-founder Andy Bechtolsheim wrote Larry and Sergey a check for $100,000, and Google Inc. was on its way to becoming a legal entity. But by that point, Sun's influence on what the Internet was had been accumulating for 15 years. The web browser was written on a Unix workstation. The first web server ran on a Unix machine. The researchers who designed TCP/IP had done their work on Unix systems. Linux, the operating system that would eventually run the servers of the entire Internet, was built explicitly as a Unix alternative for people who couldn't afford Sun hardware. Scott McNealy had articulated Sun's central conviction in a phrase that became one of the defining statements of the networked computing era. The network is the computer. In 1982, when Bechtolsheim wired a network interface into his Stanford prototype, this was an engineering insight. By 1995, it was a prophecy fulfilled. What distinguished Bechtolsheim as an engineer throughout his career was a quality that his colleagues described consistently, but that resists easy categorization. He could look at an early-stage technology, a concept, a prototype, sometimes just a clear description of what something would do, and assess its fundamental viability faster and more accurately than almost anyone around him. This wasn't optimism, it wasn't contrarianism, it was a specific kind of engineering intuition calibrated by decades of building real systems that allowed him to separate the ideas that were technically sound from the ideas that merely sounded compelling.
When Page and Brin explained their business model of sponsored links for relevant ads and 5 cents a click, Bechtolsheim did the math. 1,000,000 clicks a day, they can't go broke, and said, "Okay, let's get going." He went to his car and came back with the check. When drawing the check, Bechtolsheim misspelled the name and wrote Google instead of Google. To get the money, Page and Brin had to re-register the company using a new name. The name Google, the name the world now knows, exists because of a spelling error on a check written by the man who had spent 16 years building the Internet's hardware foundation. This is the kind of detail that history produces with straight-faced indifference to its own improbability. During the dot-com bubble, Sun Microsystems stock shot up from $5 to $64. At its peak, Sun was worth over $200 billion, a valuation built on the premise that the Internet infrastructure build-out would continue indefinitely. The demand for Sun's servers would grow as fast as the web itself was growing, and that the companies buying those servers would remain solvent long enough to pay their invoices. All three premises proved incorrect. The dot-com collapse beginning in 2000 was not primarily a technology failure. The hardware worked, the networks worked, the Internet as an infrastructure kept growing through the crash and has never stopped growing since. What failed was the financial model that had been built on top of that infrastructure, the assumption that eyeballs translated into revenue, that growth justified any burn rate, that the expansion of the 1990s represented a new permanent baseline rather than an extraordinary deviation from normal economic patterns. When the companies that had been buying Sun servers went bankrupt, they sold their hardware on the secondary market. Sun's stock collapsed back down to $5 before being acquired by Oracle for $7.4 billion. The secondary market for Sun equipment cratered the price at which new purchases could be justified. A company that could buy last year's Sun servers at liquidation prices had very little reason to buy new ones. Between fiscal years 2001 and 2005, Sun saw its sales fall 39% and its share price plummet from a peak of $64 to around $4. The cumulative losses since 2002 reached $4.5 billion by 2006. McNeely stepped down as CEO that year, replaced by Jonathan Schwartz, who spent 3 more years attempting to find a strategic position that would return the company to profitability. It never came. The diagnosis of Sun's failure has been written many times by many analysts, and the versions agree on most of the facts while differing in emphasis. The central problem was structural. Sun's business model depended on selling expensive proprietary hardware at margins that assumed customers had no viable alternative. When commodity servers running Linux, built on Intel processors following Moore's Law's relentless cost reduction curve, became capable of handling workloads that previously required SPARC servers, Sun's premium pricing became impossible to defend. Sun's engineering teams were not unaware of this threat. The company invested in Linux compatibility, in open source initiatives, in Java as a platform that could generate developer ecosystem value independent of hardware sales. Java, introduced in the mid-1990s, became one of the most widely used programming languages in history and ran on more devices than any other language. It generated enormous goodwill in the developer community and very little revenue for Sun because the internal debate about whether to treat Java as a competitive moat or a genuinely open standard was never resolved cleanly enough to execute either strategy effectively. Bechtolsheim himself had seen the trajectory clearly enough that he had left Sun in 1995, 7 years before the collapse, to found Granite Systems, a networking company that Cisco acquired the following year for $220 million. He returned to Sun briefly in the early 2000s in an engineering role, but left again before the final decline to co-found Arista Networks in 2005, a company that would eventually reach billions in revenue by solving the specific networking problems created by the cloud computing era he had helped enable. The man who had built Sun had understood before almost anyone that the industry was moving in a direction Sun's business model couldn't follow.
He didn't stay to fight a battle he believed was already decided. He built the next thing. In April 2009, Oracle Corporation announced it would acquire Sun Microsystems for $7.4 billion, a transaction valued at roughly 3.5% of Sun's peak market capitalization a decade earlier. Larry Ellison, Oracle's founder, was characteristically blunt about his intentions. He wanted Java, which Oracle planned to monetize more aggressively than Sun had. He wanted Solaris, Sun's Unix operating system. He wanted the intellectual property portfolio. He didn't particularly want to be in the hardware business, which Oracle began winding down systematically in the years following the acquisition. The Sun brand disappeared within a few years. The Mountain View campus, where McNeely and Joy and Khosla had built one of the most influential technology companies in American history, became eventually the headquarters of Google, the company that Bechtolsheim himself had funded with a check written in a Palo Alto driveway 11 years before Oracle arrived to dismantle what he had spent 20 years building.
There is a detail in Bechtolsheim's biography that the standard narrative of Sun's collapse tends to minimize because it is uncomfortable for the triumphant story of Sun's founding and the tragic story of Sun's decline to accommodate simultaneously. Bechtolsheim left Sun in 1995, 5 years before the stock peaked, 7 years before the collapse became undeniable. He didn't leave because Sun was failing. Sun in 1995 was profitable, growing, and widely regarded as one of the most technically innovative companies in Silicon Valley. He left because he had identified a specific engineering problem that Sun wasn't positioned to solve, and solving engineering problems was what he did. The problem was network switching. By 1995, Ethernet networks, the local area networks connecting computers within buildings and campuses, were running into performance limits as the volume of traffic they carried increased. The switches that routed traffic on these networks were becoming bottlenecks, and the dominant switch designs of the era were not scaling well. Bechtolsheim saw this clearly, as he tended to see hardware bottlenecks clearly, and founded Granite Systems with David Chariton to build high-speed gigabit Ethernet switches. Cisco Systems recognized what Granite had built and acquired the company in 1996 for $220 million. Bechtolsheim, who owned approximately 60% of Granite, received roughly $130 million from a company he had founded the year before. He became vice president and general manager of Cisco's Gigabit Systems business unit, and then, in December 2003, left Cisco as well. The pattern is consistent across his entire career. Identify a specific, real engineering problem, build the solution with focused intensity, and exit before the inevitable organizational bureaucratization that follows successful companies into their middle age makes the environment inhospitable to the kind of work he did best. The Google investment in 1998 came between the Granite Systems acquisition and the founding of Arista, during the brief period when Bechtolsheim was officially between ventures. He had capital, he had time, and he had, through David Chariton's introduction, access to 2 graduate students who had built something technically remarkable and needed someone who could assess it quickly and move. The timing was precise in a way that required all of the preceding circumstances to align. His departure from Granite having given him both the financial capacity and freedom to invest personally, his Stanford connection through Chariton providing the introduction, and his specific engineering background in networked systems providing the evaluative framework to recognize immediately what Page and Brin had built. When he saw the demo of Google, Bechtolsheim explained his reasoning with characteristic directness. They explained their business model of sponsored links for relevant ads and 5 cents a click. I did the math, 1 million clicks a day, they can't go broke. And I said, okay, let's get going. He went to his car and returned with the check. He later noted that it was the fastest investment decision he had ever made, and also the most important. Both things were true because of the same underlying cause. The engineering assessment was straightforward for someone with his background, and once the engineering assessment was clear, the decision had no reason to take longer.
In 2005, Bechtolsheim and Chariton founded Arastra, later renamed Arista Networks, to solve a new version of the same networking problem he had addressed with Granite a decade earlier. The emergence of cloud computing, which required data centers to move enormous volumes of traffic between tens of thousands of servers at speeds and scales that existing network architectures were not designed to handle, had created a hardware bottleneck as clear to Bechtolsheim in 2005 as the gigabit Ethernet bottleneck had been to him in 1995. Arista's approach was technically distinctive in a way that reflected Bechtolsheim's consistent engineering philosophy. Build the hardware to be as capable as possible, and build the software, Arista's EOS, Extensible Operating System, to be modular, programmable, and debuggable in ways that enterprise networking equipment had never been. The target customers were the hyperscale data centers being built by the companies running the Internet, companies that needed network equipment that could be automated, monitored, and managed with the same precision as the computing infrastructure it connected. The customers who eventually bought Arista's switches included Microsoft, Facebook, and the major cloud providers. By 2025, Arista Networks had annual revenue of $9 billion. Bechtolsheim's 15% stake, maintained through the Bechtolsheim Family Trust, represents one of the largest individual positions in a technology infrastructure company in Silicon Valley. He left Sun to build Granite. He left Granite to fund Google and build Arista. Each departure was not a retreat, but a redirection, following the technical reality of where the next genuine engineering problem was located. The pattern is so consistent across 4 decades that it stops looking like a series of individual decisions and starts looking like a philosophy. Build the thing that needs building. Leave when it no longer needs what you specifically provide. Find the next thing.
The financial arithmetic of Andy Bechtolsheim's career is instructive in the specific way that Silicon Valley outcomes are always instructive, which is to say, it rewards the specific kind of engineering judgment he demonstrated at the Sun workstation design stage and again in the Google driveway, while punishing the organizational and strategic rigidity that eventually made Sun unable to adapt. Bechtolsheim provided the first outside investment to Google in 1998 with a $100,000 check. Proceeds from his Google investment are based on the stake disclosed in the prospectus for the company's 2004 initial public offering. The precise return on that investment has never been fully disclosed, but given Google's growth from a garage startup to one of the most valuable companies in history, the $100,000 represented a return that made Bechtolsheim one of the most successful individual angel investors in the history of the technology industry. His later venture at Arista Networks, which had revenue of $9 billion in 2025 and for which he owns a 15% stake, became independently one of the most valuable technology investments in Silicon Valley history. As of 2025, Bechtolsheim's net worth was estimated at $28.9 billion, making him one of the wealthiest people in American technology, built almost entirely on the quality of his engineering judgment and his willingness to act on it without the committee meetings, the due diligence processes, and the institutional hesitation that slows most investment decisions to a pace that misses the best opportunities. Sun, the company he built, was sold for $7.4 billion and no longer exists as an independent entity. The standard reading of this outcome is that it represents a paradox, the builder of a company that failed personally becoming a billionaire through investments in companies that succeeded. But the paradox dissolves when you look at what actually connects these outcomes. Bechtolsheim's career is not 2 stories, it is one story about a specific kind of judgment operating consistently across 4 decades. The judgment that said a networked workstation could replace a mini-computer. The judgment that said Java's architectural limitation was a strategic problem Sun was never going to solve. The judgment that said 5 cents per click multiplied by 1 million daily searches was a business that couldn't fail. The judgment that said the networking problems created by cloud computing needed solutions that didn't yet exist, which became Arista.
Each of these judgments operated on the same principle: look at the actual engineering, do the actual arithmetic, and decide based on that rather than on institutional momentum, competitive anxiety, or the sunk cost reasoning that keeps organizations committed to approaches that are no longer working. Sun, the company he built, was sold for $7.4 billion and no longer exists as an independent entity.
Bechtolsheim's connection to Stanford and his good fortune came full circle in 1998 when he was invited to Stanford professor David Cheriton's house to meet two students who had an interesting product to demonstrate. The chain of connection that produced that meeting is worth tracing because it illustrates how the technology industry actually works beneath the surface of the individual decisions that become famous in retrospect. Bechtolsheim knew David Cheriton from the Stanford computer science environment that had produced Sun Microsystems 16 years earlier. Cheriton knew Page and Brin from the university research context that had always been the incubator of networked computing ideas, the same context that had produced TCP/IP, BSD Unix, and the workstation Bechtolsheim had built in that same environment in 1980. Page and Brin had built their search engine on Unix servers. They were demonstrating it on machines whose architecture descended from the Sun workstation. The entire technical substrate of what they had built connected through multiple layers back to the work that Bechtolsheim had done as a PhD student in Stanford 18 years earlier. When he walked out to his car and came back with a check, he wasn't making a leap of faith into an unknown world. He was recognizing something familiar. He had seen in 1980 that networks were going to be the defining infrastructure of computing. He had built a company on that conviction. He had watched it become true in ways that exceeded his own projections. And now two graduate students were showing him the thing that networks, once they existed, were going to be used for above all else: finding information. He understood it immediately because he had spent 18 years building the thing that made it possible. Sun Microsystems changed how computers were built, networked, and programmed. Its workstations were the machines on which the Internet's foundational technologies were developed. Its operating system influenced every Unix variant that followed, including Linux, which runs the servers of the modern Internet. Its networking protocols became standards. Its Java language runs on billions of devices. None of this saved the company from the specific competitive forces that its own success had set in motion. The workstations that put Unix on researchers' desks trained a generation of engineers who built Linux, which ran on cheap commodity hardware, which undercut the premium hardware model that Sun's revenue depended on. Sun built the foundation of the Internet and was eventually undermined by the economics that the Internet created. Bechtolsheim built Sun, left Sun, funded Google, and built Arista, following the technical reality of each successive moment rather than the institutional memory of what had worked before. The $100,000 check he wrote in a Palo Alto driveway in 1998 was not a departure from his engineering career. It was the same engineering judgment he had exercised in 1980, expressed through a different mechanism. He recognized what the thing was. He moved quickly before the committee could meet. That is the story that the check tells.